I was sitting in the pews, hands folded, eyes closed, surrounded by hymns and stained glass. It was a Sunday morning, just like the hundreds I had lived through before. The pastor was preaching, the chair was singing, and yet something in me felt absent. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't arrogance. It was something deeper, a quiet discomfort, like a splinter lodged in the soul that you can't quite find, but you feel every time you move. I believed in God. I loved him. The version I was taught never fully satisfied the questions that gnawed at me in the silence of my heart. Why did he need a son to forgive us? Why did salvation feel so exclusive, so abstract, so conditional? And why, if God was one, did I feel like I was being asked to divide him? I never intended to leave Christianity. In fact, I tried desperately to stay. I read, I prayed, I cried, I asked for signs. I clung to the cross with all I had left. But instead of finding answers, I found more questions. And every answer I received felt like a patch on a boat was already sinking. What broke me wasn't some sudden tragedy. It was the slow erosion of trust between what I believed and what I felt to be true deep within me. I remember once asking a pastor, "What about the people who never heard of Jesus? Are they just doomed?" He smiled kindly and gave me the standard answer, that God is just, and we must trust him. But inside, I was screaming, that's not enough, not clarity, that's not peace, that's avoidance. And I wasn't looking for comfort, I was looking for truth. Then one night, scrolling through videos online, I stumbled across a debate. A Muslim scholar, calmly and respectfully, was answering questions about Jesus, not attacking, not mocking, just explaining. I listened, and something happened in me, not a spark. A silence, like something inside me just sat down quietly and said, listen, I didn't become Muslim overnight. That first video led to another, and then another. I spent nights in front of my screen watching debates, lectures, testimonials. People who were once like me, people who loved Jesus but found Islam. I wasn't interested in conversion. I was searching for coherence. For once, I wanted to hear a version of God that didn't require mental gymnastics. I wanted to understand how Muslims viewed Jesus' salvation, prayer, and the purpose of life. I found was not what I expected. They believed in Jesus. They loved him, but not as a God, not as a son, but as a prophet, a man born of a miracle, chosen by God, revered without being worshipped. And in that, something clicked. Not everything, not immediately, but something. It was like the first thread being pulled from a tangled knot. I began reading the Quran cautiously, almost fearfully. I expected confusion. Instead, I found clarity. It didn't sound like any scripture I had ever read. It spoke directly. It asked questions I had never dared to ask. It challenged my assumptions and humbled my intellect. It didn't appeal to emotion. It appealed to reason. It didn't ask me to suspend thought. It invited me to think deeper. What shook me most was how it described God. One, eternal, absolute, not needing anything from creation, fathering, not begotten. The same God I always believed in but never fully knew. The God who didn't need to die to forgive. The God who simply said, be, and it is. And so began the most difficult chapter of my life. A secret journey. I kept going to church every Sunday. I still sang the hymns. I still bowed my head. But inside, I was drifting. My prayers changed, my questions deepened, and I started to feel like a stranger in my own faith. I tried talking to friends, Palestinian movement, but their responses were always the same. Don't fall into that. Islam is too harsh. They don't believe in love. But they never asked what I was feeling. They never listened, and they never knew that behind my silence was a heart breaking, not from rejection, but from awakening. I remember the first time I walked into a masjid. I didn't know what to expect. I was nervous, out of place, clearly unfamiliar, and yet no one judged me. A man greeted me with a warm smile and simply asked. First time, I nodded. He handed me a prayer mat and said, you're welcome here always. It was quiet, no music, no statues, no distractions, just space. Space to connect, space to reflect. When the prayer started, I watched in awe. The rows moved in unison. No one stood out, no performance, no show, just worship, sincere, humble, physical submission. And I wept, not because I understood every word, but because I finally understood what it meant to surrender. It took months before I said the Shahada, not because I didn't believe, because I knew what it would cost. My family, my friends, my identity. I had lived my whole life in a Christian world. To them, Islam was foreign, even frightening. But I knew I couldn't lie to myself any longer. I couldn't unsee the truth I had found. And so one quiet morning, alone in my room, whispered the words that would change everything. Ashhadu alla ilaha illa Allah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasul Allah. I testify there is no God but Allah. And I testify that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. It wasn't magic. Nothing exploded. No light shone from the ceiling. But my heart felt still. For the first time in my life, the questions stopped screaming. The silence was peaceful. I had come home, not to a place, not to a people, to a truth that had always been calling me. Telling my family was the hardest part, not because they were cruel or unloving, because they were sincere Christians. Their faith wasn't just tradition. It was a part of their identity, their memories. Church wasn't just church. It was birthdays, baptisms, weddings, funerals. It was the place where generations of my family had gathered. And now I was stepping away from all of it. I didn't tell them immediately. I wanted to wait until I had the strength to face the tears, the questions. But secrets grow heavy, especially when they concern the people you love. So one evening, sitting at the dinner table, I said it as gently as I could. I've become Muslim. The silence that followed was louder than anything I've ever heard. My mother blinked, frozen. My father leaned back in his chair, visibly stunned. It was as if I had just told them I was dying. And in a way I had. The version of me they knew, faith we once shared, the connection we felt every Sunday. It all cracked in that moment. Why? Was the first question. And I tried to explain, not to convince them, just to be understood. I talked about the unity of God, the clarity of the Quran, the peace I felt in prayer. I shared how Islam had reconnected me with Jesus, not as a distant deity, but as a beloved prophet who taught sincerity, humility, and devotion. No matter how carefully I spoke, their faces were filled with hurt. To them, I had abandoned the truth, rejected salvation, walked away from grace. They couldn't understand how I could leave Jesus behind. And that's when I told them something that seemed to confuse them even more. I didn't leave Jesus. I found him. Islam didn't make me love Jesus less. It made me love him more, not as a symbol, not as an idea, but as a real man, a prophet, a servant of God. He didn't die for my sins. He lived to teach me how to live. And that difference changed everything. But still, they wept. And I wept with them, because no matter how right it felt, it still hurt. I wasn't just changing my belief, I was changing my world. And I knew things would never be the same. Some friends stopped calling. Others made subtle comments about extremism. Some avoided the subject altogether, pretending I was going through a phase. But Islam wasn't a phase. It was a return, a rediscovery of the pure, unfiltered faith I had longed for since childhood. It was finally being able to talk to God without intermediaries, to worship without confusion, to submit without fear. Learning to pray was a journey in itself. At first, the Arabic was foreign, the movements unfamiliar. But each time I bowed, each time I placed my forehead on the ground, I felt something melt away. My ego, my pride, my pain. I wasn't performing for anyone. I was surrendering to the one who created me. And that brought a kind of peace I had never known in the loudness of the Laudes sermons. Ramadan came and I fasted for the first time. The Palestinian movement. I expected hunger. What I didn't expect was gratitude. There's something humbling about denying your body so your soul can grow. The first sip of water at sunset tasted like mercy. The first bite of food felt like a gift. It wasn't just about abstaining. It was about awareness of God, of blessings, of discipline. I realized how little we need and how much we've been given. I also discovered the beauty of community. At the Masjid, strangers became brothers. We shared meals. We shared prayers. We shared stories. No one cared about my past. No one questioned my sincerity. They saw me for who I was, a seeker. And in them, I saw reflections of my own journey, reverts from every background, people who had left behind comfort for conviction, people who knew the price of truth and paid it with grace. But Islam wasn't just about rituals. It was about transformation. It challenged me to become better, to speak kindly, to act justly, to think deeply. It wasn't about perfection. It was about striving. And for the first time, I felt like I was walking a path that made sense, both spiritually and rationally. Still, there were moments of loneliness. Holidays were the hardest. Christmas came and went without the usual warmth. Easter passed without the familiar songs. And in those moments, I missed the past. Not because I doubted my decision, but because the memory still held meaning. But even in that sadness, I found comfort in prayer. When I stood alone in the quiet night whispering to Allah, I knew I wasn't alone. I was exactly where I was meant to be. And then, one day, my mother asked to visit the Masjid with me. She didn't say much, just watched, observed. When we left, she didn't speak for a while. Then she said softly, "It's different from what I thought." I smiled. That was enough for now. Islam didn't just give me a new faith. It gave me a new lens through which to see the world. A world not divided by religion, race, or labels, but united under the oneness of our Creator. A world where every breath is a chance to worship, every action a chance to serve. I hadn't just changed religions, I had changed my purpose. And with every prayer, every verse of Quran, every act of submission, I was no longer running away from Christianity. I was running toward something greater, toward Allah, toward truth, toward peace. From the pews of the church to the floor of the Masjid, my soul had traveled far. And though the journey was painful, I would walk it all again. Because in Islam, I found not just a religion, but a home for my heart. Days I would sit quietly in my room, the Quran open in front of me, and just weep. Not out of sadness, but out of recognition. I was reading words revealed over 400 years ago in a language I was only beginning to understand, yet it felt like they were speaking directly to me. The verses weren't abstract, they were alive. They pierced through the layers of doubt and ego and spoke to my deepest questions about life, death, purpose, and everything in between. One verse in particular changed something in me forever. Indeed, in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest. I had chased peace in sermons, in songs, in emotional highs. But here it was simple, remember Him, not just on Sunday, not just in crisis, but daily, hourly, constantly. Islam made remembrance a lifestyle, not an occasion. And that consistency reshaped my entire existence. Before Islam, my relationship with God was emotional but distant. I saw Him as loving but abstract. Now I felt Him near, closer than my own thoughts. I didn't need a priest, a confession booth, or a church building to connect with Him. I could speak to Him at dawn, in my car, in prostration, in tears. And every time I turned to Him, He was there, not as a deity far away, but as my Rab, my sustainer, my guide. Learning Arabic became more than an academic goal. It became a bridge between my heart and the divine. I began memorizing small suras, slowly letting the rhythm and meaning sink in. When I recited Al-Fatiha in prayer, I didn't just say it. I felt it guide us to the straight path. That line echoed through me. It wasn't just my past prayer. It was still my present one. I wasn't seeking Islam for status or identity or belonging. I was seeking the straight path. I still am. And as I walked that path, I began to see how much of my previous understanding of Islam had been shaped by media, stereotypes, by fear. I used to associate Islam with rigidity, with violence, with harshness. But now I saw its balancing, its beauty. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, wasn't just a historical figure. He was a man of gentleness, of strength, of wisdom. A man who forgave those who tried to kill him, who wept for his followers, who lived simply, spoke truthfully, and loved deeply. The more I learned about him, the more I loved him. People often ask, what was the hardest part of converting? And honestly, it wasn't learning how to pray or giving up pork or fasting in Ramadan. It was the loneliness. The feeling of standing between two worlds, no longer fully part of the old one, not yet completely embraced by the new. That in-between space is sacred, but it's also painful. I lost friends. I became the subject of rumors. People whispered that I had been brainwashed. Others said I had betrayed my heritage. But I knew the truth. I hadn't been brainwashed. I had been reborn. My habits began to change. Not just the outward ones, like what I wore or how I prayed, but the inner ones, how I spoke, how I judged others, how I responded to hardship. I used to react with anger. Now I paused. I used to chase validation. Now I sought sincerity. Islam wasn't just a religion to practice. It was a character to embody. When I started waking up for Fajr regularly, something in my life shifted. There is something indescribable about waking up before the sun, washing in cold water, and standing in prayer while the world sleeps. It teaches you discipline. It teaches you devotion. Most importantly, it teaches you that worship isn't convenient. It's commitment. And that's what I had found in Islam, a commitment to God that didn't bend to feelings, trends, or comfort. My relationship with my family slowly began to rebuild. At first, they spoke little of my faith, but then small things happened. My mother asked what I was reciting when I prayed. My father once said, "You seem more calm these days." They didn't understand Islam, Palestinian movement, but they saw its impact. And that's what softened their hearts. Not arguments, not debates, but transformation. I learned to be patient. Everyone will understand your journey. Not everyone is ready to hear your reasons, but you walk the path anyway. Not for applause, not for approval, but for truth. And truth requires courage. every time I stood for prayer in public, every time I said no to something forbidden, every time I chose faith over fear, I was reminded why I became Muslim. There's a depth to Islam that no book can fully capture. You have to live it to taste it. And the more I lived it, the more I realized that I hadn't given up anything, had gained everything. I didn't lose Jesus. I found him in his rightful place. I didn't lose God. I found him in his purest oneness. I didn't lose freedom. I found it in submission. That word scared me once, but now it's my strength, because in a world obsessed with control, Islam teaches you to let go, to trust, to surrender, not out of weakness, but out of love. And every time I walk into the Masjid, I'm reminded of that love. The smell of clean floors, the sound of the Achaean echoing through the speakers, the sight of men standing shoulder to shoulder. Different colors, languages, stories, united in one purpose, to worship the one who created us. I used to think I had to choose between faith and reason. Islam taught me I could have both. I used to think questioning meant weakness. Islam taught me it meant growth. I used to think peace was a feeling. Islam taught me it's a result of submission to truth. Now, when I see a church, I no longer feel bitterness or anger. I feel gratitude, because that's where my journey began. And without that beginning, I might never have reached this place. Every sermon I heard, every hymn I sang, every question I asked, it all led me here, to the Masjid, to Islam, to home.